You've probably spent more than 16 years sitting in classrooms, year after year, lesson after lesson, memorizing facts, chasing grades, passing tests. But let me ask you, how many of those years were actually about learning how to think for yourself? How many moments were about real curiosity, rather than memorizing just enough to survive the next exam? From the very first day, education didn't feel like a choice. It was something expected, something imposed. You were placed on a conveyor belt. Study, obey the rules, pass the test, move forward. You were told this was the road to success, the promise of a good life. And so you complied. You worked hard, submitted your homework, respected authority, played the part of a good student. Maybe you even excelled. Maybe you earned the diploma, the job, the recognition. On the outside, everything looks fine. You're functioning, earning, contributing, managing your responsibilities. But when life slows down, when the noise fades and you're left alone with your thoughts, something feels missing. A quiet unease. Questions without answers. Who am I really? What do I actually want? Why do I feel disconnected, even after following the script so perfectly? You're not alone. Surveys show that a majority of adults, even those with prestigious degrees, admit they've questioned the deeper purpose of their lives. That isn't personal weakness. It's a signal that the system itself is flawed. Because modern schooling was never built to help you discover yourself. It was designed to make you useful, productive, and compliant, to shape you into a cog in a machine, rather than a conscious, self-aware individual. Behind the exams and certificates lies a hidden blueprint to create workers, not thinkers, to encourage obedience, not insight, to reward memorization, not reflection. You were taught how to perform tasks, not how to understand meaning, to fit in, not to question, to reach external goals while neglecting your inner world. And so even as society calls you successful, you might feel like a stranger in your own skin. High functioning, yet emotionally underdeveloped, disconnected from your own essence. Why? Because school never gave you the tools to explore yourself. It trained you to operate in society, but not to navigate the depths of your own mind. It gave you structure, but not wisdom. It equipped you for productivity, but not for purpose. And when the applause stops, when the checklist is finished, when the next step is unclear, the silence becomes deafening. That ignored inner voice finally whispers, "Is this truly me? Or just the person I was told to become?" This isn't just about education, it's about identity. About how years of conditioning trained you to seek validation outside yourself, while your inner compass was left untouched. And as an adult, you're now piecing together a self that was never nurtured. That's the great deception. Not that education failed, but that it was never intended to help you discover who you really are. Once upon a time, learning was natural, an act of wonder. You began school full of questions, curiosity, imagination. You wanted to know why. But the system wasn't built to encourage that spark. It was built to manage, to standardize, to measure, to turn living minds into predictable products. Slowly, that inner fire was dimmed. You learned that asking too many questions was disruptive. That curiosity outside the curriculum was unwelcome. That raising your hand too often was bothersome. So you adjusted. You stopped asking why, not because you stopped caring, but because you learned it was safer to stay quiet. You gave the answers they wanted. You memorized. You recited. You colored inside the lines. Learning became pressure and anxiety, not discovery. You read books not for curiosity, but for exams. You wrote essays not to express yourself, but to satisfy a rubric. Thinking became compliance. And the more you adapted, the more you lost touch with the joy of learning for its own sake. Ironically, you were praised for it. You were called a good student, not for originality, but for obedience. Not for bold ideas, but for staying out of trouble. Not for thinking freely, but for fitting the mold. And that raises the real question. If education rewards compliance over creativity, what kind of intelligence is it really cultivating? Philosophers have long said that true education means awakening the ability to think independently. But independence is inconvenient for a system built on uniformity. Free minds don't fit into standardized testing. They don't march neatly in lockstep. So instead of awakening, the system promotes imitation. Instead of nurturing questions, it drills answers. The result? A subtle flattening of the human spirit. The child who once asked why becomes the adult afraid of being wrong. The teenager who challenged rules becomes the professional who never questions company policy. The learner becomes the follower, and society calls this success. But is it? What good is achievement if it costs curiosity? What good is growth if it kills wonder? Think back. How much of your education truly belonged to you? How much was driven by passion, curiosity, or self-discovery? And how much was just survival, an endless cycle of assignments, grades, and silent pressure? The tragedy isn't that we learned facts, it's that we lost the courage to ask what they mean. We learned answers, but forgot to wonder. Education turned into management, not awakening. Into production, not exploration. Into obedience, not freedom. And those lessons don't disappear at graduation. We carry them into adulthood, still afraid to question too much, still waiting for permission, still measuring our worth by performance. But here's the truth. Maybe the first step to reclaiming yourself is not learning more, but unlearning what was imposed. Remembering the curiosity you once had, because real education begins when you stop repeating and start questioning. But how did we get here? How did education shift from discovery to conformity? It wasn't by accident. Modern schooling has roots in the industrial age. It was modeled after factories, built not to create thinkers but reliable workers. Bells signaling shifts. Rows of desks like rows of machines. Time divided into blocks. Rules enforced to keep order. Creativity suppressed, compliance rewarded. Schools became more than places of learning. They became institutions of conditioning. Not just teaching information, but teaching beliefs. That success means following rules, that authority is unquestionable, that worth depends on performance. Over time, this conditioning became invisible. We stopped noticing it. We accepted it as the normal way of growing up, and so we internalized it. We learned to wait for instructions, to seek permission, to fear mistakes, to value external validation over inner truth. Our sense of worth became tied to grades, then to promotions, then to achievements. And many of us never stopped to ask, what do I actually value? This is the hidden cost of modern education. Not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of wisdom. Not failing to train the mind, but failing to nourish the soul. And so when life throws unexpected challenges, loss, uncertainty, heartbreak, we often feel unprepared. Because school taught us how to solve equations, but not how to navigate grief. It taught us how to analyze literature, but not how to understand ourselves. It trained us to plan, but not to ask who is doing the planning. That's why so many adults, even outwardly successful ones, struggle with anxiety, identity, and purpose. Because the system equipped us to perform, but not to reflect. To achieve, but not to connect. To follow, but not to question. But awakening begins when you notice. When you start asking, where did this belief come from? Who benefits from it? Does it still serve me? Awakening isn't about rebellion for its own sake. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about remembering who you were before you were told who to be. And once you see the programming, something changes. You stop defining your worth by productivity. You stop fearing silence. You stop chasing approval. You begin to rediscover curiosity for its own sake. You read to learn, not just to pass. You write to express, not to impress. You ask questions, not to be disruptive, but because truth matters to you. That's where real education begins. Outside the classroom, in the courage to ask the questions you were once afraid to. Questions like, what do I truly value? Why do I believe what I believe? Am I living my life or just the life I was scripted into? And as you reclaim yourself, you also change how you influence others. As parents, teachers, mentors, we face new choices. Are we teaching compliance or curiosity? Are we preparing others to obey or to understand themselves? Are we praising them for obedience or for courage? Because authentic education isn't about molding people to fit a system. It's about empowering them to shape their own lives. Not to play a role blindly, but to question if the role is worth playing. Not to memorize someone else's truths, but to seek their own. And that kind of education doesn't require a classroom. It requires honesty, presence, and courage. It begins in the books you choose, the conversations you allow, the silence you sit with. It lives in the willingness to face yourself, to listen deeply, to choose truth over comfort. In the end, real education is not preparation for life. It is life itself. It's the ongoing process of awakening, of unlearning, of remembering how to wonder, how to feel, how to choose for yourself. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all, that you were never meant to simply fit in. You were meant to wake up, to unlearn, to return to yourself,